In an unexpected and dramatic turn of events, Canada has halted all food imports from the United States, triggering more than just a routine trade dispute. We have a target to hit 1,000 subscribers. Help us to reach. It's become a full-blown national crisis. With 3.4 million American jobs at stake, the sudden rupture has left many scrambling to comprehend the economic shockwave. For decades, American grocery stores have relied on Canadian demand to stabilize food supply chains and keep prices manageable. But following a heated political fallout and the imposition of sharp tariffs, Canada has taken a definitive stand. As a result, store shelves across the US are running low, prices are climbing, and farmers are grappling with uncertainty. The question on everyone's mind is why Canada made such a sweeping decision, what it means for American workers and consumers, and how this could alter the long-standing power dynamics between the two nations. The ripple effects have been immediate and painful. Businesses accustomed to a steady stream of Canadian revenue were caught off guard. Food producers in regions like the Midwest and the South were stunned when long-standing orders for dairy, grains, and produce were abruptly cancelled. Perishable goods began to spoil in storage facilities, inflicting severe financial damage. Logistics firms were thrown into disarray as trucks headed for Canadian supermarkets were rerouted or stranded, turning once profitable delivery routes into money pits. Amid rising fuel costs, many trucking companies were forced to reduce staff, and in Texas alone, hundreds of drivers were laid off within days. The consequences have been harsh and personal. A Wisconsin dairy farmer who had recently expanded his operation to meet growing demand in Toronto found himself dumping milk with no buyers. His workforce, some with deep family ties to the farm, faced sudden unemployment. Food processors were hit just as hard. One canning plant in upstate New York, which had recently landed a major Canadian contract, was left with warehouses full of unsold inventory. Its manager, stunned by the sudden collapse in demand, likened the experience to watching years of effort vanish overnight. Political leaders in Washington were slow to act, with both Republicans and Democrats scrambling to craft a coherent response. President Trump, instead of addressing the economic fallout, pointed fingers at Canada's leadership, accusing them of acting out of spite. He dismissed Prime Minister Carney's move as a publicity stunt and reassured Americans that the US economy was resilient enough to withstand the disruption. Yet behind closed doors, his advisors were raising red flags, warning that the boycott could escalate into a severe economic crisis. As American businesses reeled, entire communities braced for collateral damage. In towns that rely heavily on cross-border trade, the impact was immediate and deeply felt. Places like Buffalo, New York, and Detroit, Michigan, which depend on Canadian shoppers and tourists, saw their local economies take a sharp hit. In Buffalo, a restaurant owner who once thrived on a steady flow of Canadian customers now found his dining room nearly deserted. Parking lots that were once filled with Ontario license plates were suddenly empty. "I've never seen it this bad. Not even during the pandemic," he said. Dairy farmers in Michigan, who regularly shipped milk to Ontario, faced looming bankruptcy as orders dried up. With plummeting prices and growing inventories, many were forced to lay off workers, often their own relatives. Local leaders moved quickly, holding town hall meetings that turned tense as residents demanded urgent action. In Minnesota, a mayor organized a rally urging the federal government to resolve the standoff, with protesters holding signs like, "Fix the food fight and don't starve our towns." But food wasn't the only sector taking a hit. Canada was also pulling the plug on US tourism. The move delivered another crushing blow. Canadian airlines began canceling flights to major American destinations, and vacation packages to places like Florida and California were scrapped en masse. The result was catastrophic for the tourism industry. Hotels that once counted on Canadian snowbirds saw occupancy rates plunge by 60%. A Florida motel owner who had welcomed Canadian retirees for over 30 years faced an alarming drop in bookings. Normally full by midwinter, his property now sat half empty. "Without the Canadians," he admitted, "I might have to shut down." Tour operators and theme parks, from Arizona to Texas, began reporting significant financial losses as Canadian visitors canceled their travel plans. Gas stations along major highways, leading from the border, noticed a steep drop in traffic. which didn't just hurt tourism. It sent shockwaves through local economies that relied on consistent cross-border movement. But just as the US tourism industry started to unravel, Canada rolled out the next stage of its strategy, this time zeroing in on one of America's most vital economic sectors, agriculture. The crisis was far from over, and the economic pressure was only intensifying. As the situation continues to evolve, we're committed to following every development. Like and subscribe to stay informed. Your support helps us keep investigating the real story behind the headlines. When news of Canada's food boycott reached the US, President Trump responded with characteristic force. Refusing to take the blow in stride, he escalated the situation dramatically. Known for his hard-line stance on trade and foreign policy, Trump interpreted the boycott as an affront to American sovereignty and an attack on economic stability. The White House quickly issued a statement condemning Canada's actions as economic warfare, directly accusing Prime Minister Mark Carney of undermining a mutually beneficial partnership. But Trump didn't stop at rhetoric. He launched a wave of retaliatory tariffs aimed squarely at Canada's agricultural exports, including dairy, maple syrup, and grains. The tariffs were designed to inflict maximum economic pain. Dairy, long a sticking point in US-Canada trade negotiations, was hit the hardest, with tariffs jumping to 25% overnight, effectively locking Canadian producers out of the American market. Maple syrup, a cultural and economic symbol of Canada, was slapped with a 30% tariff, while wheat, barley, and other grain products saw similar spikes. These measures were intended to pressure Canada into backing down, but they also sent shockwaves through American supply chains. Food processors, who had come to rely on affordable Canadian imports, suddenly found themselves facing shortages and price surges. Dairy plants in Wisconsin and Minnesota, heavily dependent on cross-border milk shipments, reported reduced production and even temporary shutdowns. Maple syrup distributors warned of dwindling inventories and surging prices as they scrambled to source domestic alternatives. Grocery store prices began to climb, especially for dairy and grain-based products, as the tariffs took hold. Beyond the economic impact, the political fallout was swift. Republican senators from agricultural states began voicing their alarm, concerned that Trump's retaliatory tariffs could backfire by hurting the very communities they represented. The Midwest, a region where farming is the backbone of the economy, was particularly at risk. As tensions escalated, fears grew that a prolonged trade war with Canada could cause lasting damage to American agriculture and deepen divisions within the political landscape. As one senator from Iowa bluntly stated, "We cannot afford to lose our northern trading partner. This tariff strategy risks hurting our own farmers more than it hurts Canada." Amid the turmoil, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a powerful address that rallied support across his country. Speaking to a crowd of farmers in Saskatchewan, he emphasized resilience and independence, casting the boycott as a defining moment. "We will not be broken by tariffs or threats. Canada's agricultural strength lies in our resilience and our unity," he declared. The message struck a chord nationwide, bolstering national pride and a sense of shared purpose in the face of US pressure. While President Trump remained locked in an escalating trade war, another crisis was unfolding at home, one that struck at the heart of American culture: fast food. Fast food chains, long considered a symbol of American identity, were among the most immediate and visible casualties of the growing economic rift. Major brands like McDonald's and Wendy's began to struggle with spiking costs for key ingredients like beef, cheese, and produce. With Canadian imports cut off, supply chains buckled. Menu options were slashed, prices rose sharply, and some franchises were pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. In Buffalo, a McDonald's manager expressed frustration, saying, "When you can't get cheese for your burgers, customers go somewhere else." Employee hours were reduced, foot traffic declined, and, in some cases, locations were forced to close temporarily. On social media, public frustration erupted. Hashtags like New Year Burger Crisis and New Year Boycott Fast Food trended, and activists began urging consumers to turn to local alternatives instead. This disruption, however, gave rise to something more than short-term outrage. It sparked a growing consumer movement. What began as a necessity quickly evolved into a broader campaign of economic self-determination. Buy local, boycott America. Far from a fleeting trend, this movement marked a cultural and economic shift. Canada's boycott of US food imports was more than a retaliatory gesture. It was a calculated step toward redefining national food policy. Faced with the risk of shortages, the Canadian government responded with bold action. Under Prime Minister Carney, federal and provincial leaders launched the Food Sovereignty Initiative, a sweeping program aimed at ending reliance on American imports by turbocharging domestic agriculture. Billions were invested in local farming, and grants were issued to producers across the dairy, grain, and fresh produce sectors, enabling them to scale up quickly. The effort wasn't limited to rural areas. In major cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, urban farming exploded. Rooftops, schoolyards, and empty lots were transformed into thriving gardens. Local governments supported the movement with incentives for residents to grow their own food, fueling a cultural renaissance around self-sufficiency and sustainability. What could have been a supply chain crisis became a national moment of unity. Canadians embraced the challenge, and a new pride in local agriculture took root. The economic impact was substantial. Community-supported agriculture, CSA programs, flourished, connecting consumers directly to local farms. These arrangements ensured predictable income for small producers while fostering strong community ties. Domestic dairy and grain production surged, meeting the bulk of the country's needs. Supermarkets and restaurants began to highlight Canadian-grown ingredients, shifting consumer expectations away from imported goods. Socially, this transformation blossomed into a movement. Online campaigns promoting local businesses and products went viral with hashtags like #BuyCanadian, dominating Canadian social media. Farmers' markets became vibrant community centers, and choosing local was no longer just an option. It was a statement of identity and national pride. One remarkable success story came out of Alberta, where a dairy cooperative managed to triple its output in just 6 months. With financial support from the Food Sovereignty Initiative, they upgraded their equipment, expanded their herds, and stabilized milk prices at a moment when US imports had all but vanished. The cooperative quickly became a national symbol of resilience, proof that Canada wasn't just surviving the boycott, but thriving because of it. Yet, the story didn't stop at recovery. Canada's ability to bounce back sent a powerful signal to the rest of the world, and what followed was a wave of international support that reshaped global trade dynamics. While the United States lashed out in retaliation, the international community saw opportunity. Countries that had long sought deeper trade ties with Canada stepped in to fill the vacuum left by US imports. Far from being isolated, Canada suddenly found itself at the heart of a new, diversified food network. Europe was among the first to respond. The European Union moved quickly to sign agricultural trade agreements with Canada, providing dairy and grains to temporarily replace US products. The move helped stabilize Canadian grocery prices and was praised by EU leaders as a strategic investment in food sovereignty and global trade balance. The support wasn't just economic, it was political. Canada's pivot was applauded as a bold, forward-looking shift, and Europe made it clear they saw a long-term partner. Across the Pacific, Asia also stepped up. Japan and South Korea began negotiating multi-year contracts for Canadian wheat, barley, and beef. These agreements guaranteed stable income for Canadian farmers during the transition and helped secure the country's agricultural base. With a consistent export stream and reliable trading partners, Canada's internal market remained resilient, even as trade with the US ground to a halt. But perhaps the most symbolic shift came from Mexico. As another major food exporter, Mexico agreed to ramp up its supply of fresh produce to Canada, sending shipments of tomatoes, avocados, and peppers. It wasn't just a pragmatic arrangement, it was a geopolitical message. The realignment signaled a North American trade shift that intentionally bypassed the United States. The results of this international pivot were immediate and impactful. Canadian food markets, which had seen brief spikes in prices during the early days of the boycott, began to stabilize as these new global supply chains took effect. Grocery store shelves were restocked, and consumer anxiety eased. The influx of global partnerships did more than protect Canada's food supply. It fortified its economic independence. On the world stage, Canada emerged as a symbol of adaptability and resilience. Media outlets from London to Tokyo praised the nation's proactive strategy, often contrasting it with what they saw as the United States' reactive and punitive approach. Back in the US, the consequences of the boycott were triggering more than economic ripples. They were igniting political fires. Agricultural states that had supported Trump's tough talk on trade were now facing economic collapse, and many of them turned on Washington. In states like Iowa, Kansas, and Wisconsin, farmers accused the federal government of sacrificing their livelihoods for political grandstanding. Emergency meetings were called. Governors from both parties began publicly pressuring the White House to rethink the tariff strategy and re-establish trade dialogue with Canada. The divide between Washington and the heartland widened, exposing cracks in the political coalition that had long underpinned American agricultural policy.